And now I give the floor to the representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to congratulate you on assuming the chairmanship of the presidency of the Security Council for this month and for the excellent way in which you are undertaking your task. Mr. President, we have followed with great attention the briefings presented by the chairman of the subsidiary bodies during this session, and we thank those chairmen for their briefings. My country, Syria, reaffirms its condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, regardless of its source, its perpetrators, be they individuals, groups, or states, because it is aggressive and unjust criminal acts that target the lives and property of innocent people, and because its effects touch everybody without distinction. Mr. President, today started as a sunny, beautiful day in your capitals and in most capitals across the world. But today in Damascus, it was a bloody day. Our capital shook as a result of 2 suicide terrorist bombings which took the lives of 56 innocent individuals and injured 372 others who received grave injuries. In addition to the remains of 15 individuals who still have not been identified. This is what characterizes the morning that Damascus witnessed today as different from the morning of all other capitals in the world. It is so appropriate, Mr. President, that I am delivering my statement today on behalf of my government, addressing the members of the Security Council, since we are all here discussing anti-terrorism. At 7:30 of this morning, 2 suicide terrorist bombers exploded 2 vehicles laden with explosives in a densely populated area filled with civilians in the Syrian capital of Damascus. That area contained 4 schools, primary schools, preparatory schools, and secondary schools. The 2 explosions took place at a time when students were on their way to school. And the explosions led, as I explained earlier, to tens of innocent victims, both civilians and military. The Special Envoy, Mr. Kofi Annan, quickly condemned this cowardly act, as did General Mood, Chief of the Observer Mission. We expect from the Security Council, under your wise leadership, a clear and strong condemnation of this cowardly act and a firm position to deal with this act in all its dimensions, Arab, regional, and international dimensions. This explosion took place at the same time as another explosion that was carried out in Aleppo this morning, and which led also to several civilian victims and massive damages to private property. Mr. President, the distinguished members of the Council are well aware that while Syria witnessed a noticeable reduction in the levels of violence, there has been recently an increase in the scale and frequency of terrorist activities and operations in Syria. Extremist terrorist groups have emerged using unusual criminal methods by carrying out organized terrorist operations based on extremist, takfiri rulings, i.e. Those that label others with apostasy, and these are issued by inciters who reside in countries very well known to everybody. These groups use suicide bombers, booby-trapped cars, and explosive belts and packages to attack targets in vital facilities and the infrastructure in various areas and to spread fear among citizens. This was apparent in the terrorist explosions in various areas in Damascus, as well as the explosions in Aleppo and the two recent terrorist explosions in the province of Idlib. Those were the two explosions where the Security Council failed regrettably to condemn them, and that was for unjustified political reasons. The same applies to the terrorist explosion which took place yesterday in Daraa and targeted a convoy of a team from the observer mission and led to injuries among the Syrian protective security forces accompanying that team. That incident led the Secretary General to condemn that explosion and all acts of violence and the explosion of explosive charges that take place in Syrian cities, in addition to the targeting of law and order forces, civilians, private and public property on a daily and continuous basis, as well as armed robbery, banditry, theft, vandalism, attacks on citizens in their homes and in their shops in order to provoke and terrorize them, the kidnapping of individuals for ransom, which money is then used to support terrorist activities. The number of those kidnapped from among the personnel of the army, the police, and the security forces during the period from March 24th to April 26th alone, 220 individuals. And some of these terrorist organized acts have carried the stamp of the Al-Qaida methods and ideology, including mutilation of corpses and the killing of entire families based on purely sectarian affiliation and the carrying out of simultaneous suicidal explosions in more than one area. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been careful since the beginning of these events to emphasize the existence of armed terrorist organizations associated with Al-Qaida who are carrying out the most horrible crimes in Syria. But many political parties and hostile media have cast doubts on that. And here today we are witnessing the public adoption by groups and organizations affiliated with Al-Qaida of terrorist activities and operations carried out in Syria in response to calls issued by leaders of Al-Qaida such as Al-Zawahiri, who called for jihad in Syria. We have also been hearing statements issued by the leadership of Western intelligence agencies admitting that Al-Qaeda branch in a neighboring state of Syria was the one which stood behind the terrorist explosions that Syria had witnessed recently in Damascus and Aleppo after the infiltration of elements from Al-Qaeda into the ranks of the armed opposition which is fighting against the Syrian government authorities. And various Arab and non-Arab media are telling us from one day to the other about the death of foreign fighters from various nationalities in Syria while carrying out terrorist operations in Syria. In fact, there are websites affiliated with Al-Qaeda organizations who lament the loss of members of their groups while carrying out their terrorist activities in Syria. Mr. President, I have a list that includes 26 names of terrorists. Some of them are associated or affiliated with Al-Qaeda. We have transmitted this list to the attention of the Secretary General and the President of the Security Council and the Chairman of subsidiary bodies on counter-terrorism. In addition to that letter, we have admissions, confessions recorded from these same individuals in which they confess that they are terrorists and that they have arrived into the country in order to carry out terrorist operations. This evidence is available with our delegation, and we can provide any member of the Security Council with copies. In addition, Mr. President, we have this massive amount of documents. Documents, I repeat, recorded documents. They are all in English. And they all document terrorist activities and the names of individuals along with their citizenships and those who have incited them and motivated them, and you will soon receive that as well as will the Secretary General and the Chairman of subsidiary bodies. In addition, Mr. President, we have a list that contains 12 names of 12 terrorists who were killed in Syria. 12 foreign terrorists, including one French citizen, one British citizen, one Belgian citizen. This list also is available with us, and we will send it to you, and we request that you distribute it to the members of the Security Council. Mr. President, terrorist operations cannot be carried out without the availability of financing and support in the form of funds, weapons, and individuals. Unfortunately, some Arab, regional, and international states have provided these facilities to armed terrorist groups in order to carry out terrorist activities in Syria. These countries have pledged publicly and openly to provide support in the form of weapons, funds, and training, and the provision of safe havens for terrorists for the purpose of carrying out terrorist and sabotage activities against the peace and security of the Syrian state and the Syrian people. To do that, they are using smuggling across the borders of neighboring states. Mr. President, the supply of funds and weapons to armed groups is a reality encountered daily and every hour by the customs authority and the border guard in Syria. High-level officials in countries neighboring Syria have spoken publicly about disrupting operations to smuggle weapons, money, and individuals into Syria. For example, the statement by the Foreign Minister of Lebanon on March 20th about the Lebanese authority arresting 27 individuals on charges of smuggling weapons to Syria. Also, the statement by the director of the Jordanian General Security Services about the detention by Jordanian authorities of a number of individuals who have tried to smuggle weapons to Syria through the border crossings between the two countries. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, we have sent tens of letters to the Security Council and to the Secretary General on this topic. Most recently was the letter we sent on April 24th concerning the terrorists who had been arrested in Syria after they infiltrated through the borders coming from other countries for the purpose of carrying out terrorist operations in Syria, most of whom belong to Al-Qaida. On this occasion, I would like to notify your esteemed Council that the Lebanese authorities, whom we thank, have detained and seized on April 27th the ship called Lutfallah II, which had sailed from the Misrata port in Libya on its way to Lebanon via the port of Alexandria in Egypt, carrying the amount of 180 tons of various weapons and advanced communication equipment, including RPG launchers and French Lao anti-tank launchers and anti-aircraft launchers, and amounts of TNT explosives which were intended to be smuggled into Syria for use in armed terrorist operations. Add to that the statements by some armed terrorist groups which also indicate that they succeeded previously in bringing shipments into Syria, including American Stinger rockets, anti-aircraft rockets, at a time when a high-level official in the Libyan Provisional Council has announced that 5,000 anti-aircraft missiles have been misplaced or lost from the Libyan arsenals. And there have been statements that Turkey and Libya have cooperated with other states, Arab and non-Arab, in sending lethal weapons to armed groups in Syria to spread death and destruction. It is strange that this ship has crossed into Lebanese territorial water Egypt and has passed by the positions of the maritime units of UNIFIL without any interdiction from these units. Mr. President, joint understandings to conspire to send weapons and smuggle it into Syria and to facilitate the crossing of terrorists into Syria are in contradiction with any political solution of the crisis in Syria and do not lead at all towards facilitating or supporting the resolutions of the Security Council or Mr. Kofi Annan's plan. In fact, they merely constitute an attempt to assassinate Mr. Annan's mission, and they constitute also a blatant attack on Syrian sovereignty. A week ago, this esteemed council, in a session chaired by the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, has reaffirmed in its presidential statement the strong and unequivocal denunciation and condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, regardless of their perpetrators, its location, and its purposes. And from this rostrum, we are calling upon your esteemed council to translate these words into deeds and to take immediate actions and immediate necessary actions in order to stop all terrorist activities taking place in Syria and to exert maximum pressure on the states which are facilitating and financing and inciting the groups that are perpetrating this terrorism. In order for us to comply with the Security Council resolutions, both those dealing with terrorism and with Syria. Terrorist acts, Mr. President, have cost us precious blood of our people. There will come a day when we shall hold accountable all those who took part in these activities, who incited them, who financed them, or facilitated their commitment. Terrorism is an international crime that requires an international response. This was the gist of the statement of all members of the Council. Accordingly, combating terrorism cannot be selective or relative or subjective. It must match deeds to words. We also call upon the Security Council committees for the implementation of resolutions 1267, 1989 and 1373 to fulfill their tasks and mandates in order to implement the substance of these resolutions in relation to the events in Syria. Mr. President, the terrorist activities taking place in Syria now, which target the stability of the state and the nation and the society, are no less dangerous than the terrorist activities that targeted New York on September 11th. And the terrorist activities that targeted Madrid and London. There is no righteous terrorism and malicious terrorism. There is only one terrorism that must be combated. It is the terrorism that targets Syria is the same one that targets New York, London, Madrid, and other cities. There is also media terrorism, and there is cultural terrorism, and there is political terrorism, and economic terrorism. all of that is terrorism. It is not sufficient for a member state in this international organization to finance the creation of a center for counterterrorism, while at the same time it stands behind the incitement for the perpetration of terrorism in my country and the financing of terrorism groups in my country. Terrorism is one and the same. Finally, Mr. President, terrorism throughout the world is caused primarily by Zionist terrorism, which was initiated by Israel much earlier in the life of this international organization. Back in the 50s, Israel kidnapped the first civilian aircraft. For the first time in the world, it was a Syrian aircraft in 1954, the first time that a civilian aircraft was hijacked. That was carried out by Israel in 1954. And then Israel carried out a series of terrorist activities that you are well aware of, and which led to the displacement of millions of Palestinians from their homes. The sequence of Israeli terrorism has continued to this day. The words that you heard from the speaker who spoke just before me was merely a diversion to divert attention from Israeli terrorism, the sole purpose of which is to undermine the possibility of establishing a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And to focus attention on other issues away from the state terrorism of terrorism, which is well evidenced, documented in thousands of documents issued by the United Nations in New York and in Geneva. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of Syrian Arab Republic, and now I give the floor to